I will now give the floor to Dr. Nitasha Kaul, Associate Professor of Politics and International Relations, University of Westminster in London, and she will speak on Hindutva and state minorities in India.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm always a little apprehensive when people introduce me as this brave and fearless person, because the first thing that runs through my mind is, what should I be afraid of? Really, my response to that is fearing hate is the worst thing that you can do wherever you are, whoever you are, because hate is not to be something that you must be afraid of, but something that you must pity and then follow up with understanding and then follow up with trying to resolve it. So yes, I'm not afraid, and in front of any audience that will not physically attack me or each other. And that, I think, is the essence of all publics. So I must also add a couple of caveats before I begin. Firstly, I speak for myself. As Virginia Woolf said, a woman, in a sense, has no nation. And in that sense, I speak for myself. I do not represent any nation, community, group, or anything. What I say anywhere reflects my histories, my memories, and my journey of my ideas and spaces. So I speak for myself, and I would also like to add that in spite of the instances of levity and things that I may say with an aside, the fundamental fact of the matter is that what I talk about are cartographies of pain. These are not just lines on a map. These are lines that affect people who are much less fortunate than us to be sitting in safe spaces. I think we all have a right to dream, as Eduardo Galeano said, and that is an important right that we must cherish. Okay, so the topic that I have been, that I was requested to speak of is Hindutva and the State of Minorities in India, Responses from the World. So let me tell you, as a person of Kashmiri origin who is British and who hails from the subcontinent, there are histories here that are so heavy that any amount of time is impossible to summarize them in. And in a sense, I may even just start by saying to the Britons, to the Indians, to the Pakistanis, all of you ate up my history, all of you have eaten up the memory, and it's the same for every Kashmiri. These, this is your love people more, love territories less. This is something that has been going on for as long as we've had capitalist modernity, which is to say at least the last few centuries. And we can, not everyone can pick up a gun, not everyone has the power to rule governments, but everyone has a story. And the point of this and many other persecutions that are happening globally against minorities is that we all have our truths, and the important thing is to recognize there isn't a truth with a capital T. There are truths with little t's. And until and unless you physically eliminate people, there is no way that you are going to force somebody to change their truth. So the only way forward is to talk to people, is to get people to talk to each other and understand where their differences lie and how we can move beyond them. So, and this, it seems like a very simple thing. In fact, most of what I tell you, it's all very simple. We all know it at a very fundamental level, but sometimes the simplest things are the hardest to remember. The most, to people who say, oh, these are issues of grand games and strategy and power, and I tell them, you were a child once, right? You had a right to dream. So don't call me an idealist, because everyone is an idealist when it comes to their children. Everyone wants education and healthcare and safe spaces and freedom from violence and freedom from discrimination for their own children. So we can all then try, at least, to be idealists for other people too. And wherever I speak, whatever I do, whoever I challenge, that's what I'm trying to tell you. It may seem like a moral high ground, so what? I think that we all are bound to fail at one point or another, but it's important to remember that that is the only way anyone can move forward. Okay, so with that as preface, let me then say that Hindutva, we've just been given a very comprehensive account of Hindutva and its very complicated relationship through its various evolutions with economic nationalism. But Hindutva, that as we recognize it today, is something that is prevalent in India in its form of majoritarian religious nationalism. But it's also something that is evident globally in terms of the effects of the diaspora, firstly. but also in terms of the way in which it links as an ideology with other similar ideologies that it interlinks with. The example given just now about the people in the UK who sought to not have caste included as a protected characteristic is a good example of how these forces can work. I'm sure Akis would have referred to, I'm sorry I had to go out, but Akis would have referred to the way in which followers of Trump and followers of Modi see their cause in common. And in fact campaigned. Trump was on record having said, "Ab ki baar Trump Sarkar." So that tells you something about how these dynamics work. But these are not just stories about people doing these things in terms of a realm that's outside the economy, because economic relationships are a key part of this story too. So the most significant moment for Hindutva is the early 90s onwards, when you have not just the rise of that Hindutva and at present, as we say, see the Modi-led BJP, but also the arrival of neoliberalism. And that is a conundrum that has been inappropriately resolved even now. As scholars, people might want to study the economy in one box and society in the other, but that's not how the world works. These two changes, you can study them as separate trends, but they were happening to people, to societies at the same time. And that's something that merits a lot more analysis. So this form of majoritarian Hindu nationalism, which has evolved after 1990s, reflects a consolidation and a creation of a political cultural majority, which is the self-identity of people, their construction in terms of an entity. And that then becomes politically salient. So it's not a political majority, which can change. It's a cultural majority. When a cultural majority becomes a political majority, then democracy starts to be a problem, because people are not voting on political issues, as we know, as we would think of them as political issues. So here we are at the brink of elections in India. Here we are in the aftermath of Pulwama. It's an important moment to reflect, I think, for everyone, because some people, of course, want to just watch the world burn, as Batman's butler said in that famous movie. But there are many people who don't want to watch the world burn, and who would think otherwise, or for whom it is possible to think otherwise. So I want to say, since it's a global response, I want to say this is part of a global moment. It's a moment that reflects the rise globally of electorally legitimated, misogynist, authoritarian governments that masquerade as nationalists, claim to challenge neoliberalism, while at the same time profiting from it. I'll just repeat that sentence again. These are electorally legitimated governments. Not necessarily, I wouldn't say they're necessarily democratic, they're electorally legitimated. They're misogynist authoritarians. To all of these strongman leaders, misogyny is a key component of how they exercise their power, they build their support. And by the way, when I say misogyny, that doesn't mean that women are immune from misogyny. It's just a way in which it works as a strategy of strongman exercise of power. Misogynist authoritarianism, which masquerades as nationalism, and a very toxic version of it, claims to challenge neoliberalism. In all of these leaders do that, but it profits from it because they end up being crony capitalists. So whether you look at the examples, and you can pick any examples, you may like some of them less or more, but I will just randomly pick examples from around the world. Duterte in Philippines, Putin in Russia, Modi in India, Erdogan in Turkey, Bolsonaro in Brazil, Trump in the US, Orban in Hungary, just some of the most egregious examples, which have to a lesser or greater extent used this strategy of power. These are, I hesitate to use the word populists, because in most of the cases, including in the Hindutva government currently in power, their actual vote share is nearly 30-something%. So yes, in a scholarly sense, we might say they're populists because they're creating a kind of populism, but it reflects a fractured nature of the electorate, so they don't actually have 100% or 80% of the public behind them. They have just managed to create an ideology that works to create a single bloc amongst many fractured sections of the electorate. How they do that? Well, they do that through, firstly, Messianism. This one guy is going to solve all our problems. It's a hagiography of the great leader whose posters you see everywhere. And this great leader is going to come in and solve everyone's problem with a magic wand, because nobody has known how to do politics before. Consensus is a problem, democracy is a problem. This great leader will solve everything. Well, of course, Messianism doesn't work in this sense, and the great leader doesn't solve the problems. They see the past as a future, I'm coming here from a Brexit-torn in UK, UK United, I mean, really. And this idea of this return to a glorious past as a future works in two ways. For the formerly colonized parts of the world, it works in the sense that we were colonized once, but now we'll find our glory. And this messianic leader will bring you your glory. For that part of the world, it's the same thing but inverted. We will go back to our past imperial nostalgia as glory. We'll just go back there again with Brexit or with Make America Great Again or whatever, you name it. So in this part of the world, of course, in the Indian context, it works as going back to a nativist past. Now, neither of these two things is wrong. It's not wrong to say colonialism was a tremendously awful process. It literally made and ruined the world. But as a facile retreat into a kind of unquestioning nativism is also a problem, because that again eliminates dissent in similar ways. So these and all of these cases also, I think, since we are referring to Hindutva here, they are preceded by changes in the education systems, and these education systems are where consciousness is created. It also relies upon creating groups, alliances between groups that normally would not see common cause with each other. So if you look at the way in which people who are corporates, people who are economic nationalists, people who are neoliberals, people who are tribal and indigenous Hinduized people, they do not have their interests in common. But this kind of political strategy of power creates a discourse that makes them think that their interests are in common, and that is how they come to power in a very fractured society. So it relies upon bringing these disparate groups together, which is why they often can't deliver, as we know from employment or so-called development data. They can't deliver because it's impossible to deliver. The thing to do is to recognize these are disparate interests, and you have to find ways of policy reconciling them, not making people believe that they actually don't have any differences in common, but making people believe they don't have those differences in common and that their interests are not at odds with each other is easier when you sell them, when you use a rhetoric which is moral and metaphysical. So instead of saying something is good or bad or right or wrong, you say something is good or evil. It's not just wrong, it's not just something you can disagree with, it's fundamentally evil. And you can't disagree with evil. You can, it's not possible to disagree with evil. It's a metaphysical thing. If you have to go through suffering in order, of the soul of the nation, in order to deal with the economic repercussions of demonetization, then that's not a discourse that's about data or statistics or economy. That's about soul and suffering. And that is not, then there's no political left in that theological battle for the soul of the nation. And democracies, modern democracies in these modern nation states that we find in, have to deal with these things with a democratic consciousness. And that democratic consciousness does not mean you do not recognize the place for theology, the place for religion. It means that that place is not where it is right now. But of course, it's profitable for these leaders to do that. I think it is also tremendously unfortunate, as I'm sure Rakesh would have pointed out, that this is all happening against the backdrop of an isolationist impulse, where we are seeing a delinking, nations choosing to delink from a globally interlinked architecture of norms that was painstakingly built in the aftermath of the Cold War. So when it comes to climate change, human rights, whatever, nations are choosing to say, no, my glory, my sovereignty, Brexit is another example, but anywhere in the world, where this is about me and I can solve these problems within my nation state boundaries. Yes, you can in a world of autarkies, but not in the world that we live in now, not in the world that has technology. By the way, I forgot to mention the use of technology, of trolls, of that kind of use of technology, both to shock and awe people, as well as to make them feel create fake news. This is, again, a key part of how this populist strategy creates majorities where none exist. So it's happening against this breakdown. It's also happening against an Anthropocene. It's happening against a climate change crisis. Disasters, natural disasters, we know, do not discriminate between boundaries that we draw on maps. It's happening against, and these prolonged conflicts and the new emergent threat perceptions seem to just be replicating the Cold War era. It's like we're yearning to go back to a world of those kinds of enemies, and we're trying to create that right now with the threat perceptions, around China, around US, around Russia. And that's, we can continue doing it that way. you'll call me a dreamer, you'll say we will continue doing it that way. I'll say fine, I'll just continue protesting, I'll just continue saying that's not the way to create a safer world or a better world or to solve any conflict. Thank you. And we're also seeing this against the breakdown of a liberal democratic consensus where economic inequality is rising. So, people are dispossessed and that is suffering. And they suffer. The state of minorities, when we talk about minorities, religious minorities are of course the key ones here, Islamophobia, but also other kinds of attacks on other religions, on Christians and others. Discriminations, not every lynching has to, people don't have to be lynched to be made to feel that they do not belong. Developmental minorities, tribals and indigenous people, gender minorities, intellectual minorities, people who are atheists, rationalists, secularists, are being called anti-nationals, people who speak for science, being told that science isn't real. Regional minorities, which are manifest in different forms. Kashmir is, of course, a good example. You won't, maybe this audience will appreciate, you won't imagine the number of times I've been hounded online by people who say, what about Kashmiri Pandits? Well, here I am in Pakistan and I'm saying, what about Kashmiri Pandits? What about it? It is, they are also a religious minority in the Kashmir context. They are also a casualty of the dispute. Until and unless we put all of these things together, we are not going to move forward. Attacks, wars, they're not going to solve anyone's problem in the long run. So I'm saying that we need to talk, that everyone needs to talk. It's the simplest thing, but it's the hardest thing. And I think that talking can also, by the way, so then the other responses go to Pakistan. So here I am, but of course not every dissenter can go to Pakistan. I'm sure you're not large enough territorially to accommodate every dissenter from across the border. So what can be done? I think we must magnify and amplify the moderate voices. We must magnify those who speak against violence, those who speak against war. We must study better post-colonial, I will conclude by giving you hope, of course. We must study post-colonial histories and post-colonial international relations for the world that we live in now. We must call things as they are. You remember how wars are enabled by calling deaths collateral damage? Well, let's do the anti-euphemism. Let's call hawks killers and let's call doves peace builders. Let's say we want, this is a dovish position. Let's say we want a peace-building position. We don't want a killer position. And I think that words make a difference. It's not, strength is a matter of actually what you accomplish, not simply a stance that you a priori have. Do not confuse power with violence. Very often, as Hannah Arendt has told us, very often the resort to violence results from a vacuum of power. When you don't have power, you need to resort to violence. Actual power is built upon agreement, not by the use of violence or weapons. Develop mechanisms of radical democracy. Radical democracy is a theoretical term. Radical democracy means that you see the enemy not as an enemy, but as an opponent. I can disagree with you, we can talk, but if we kill each other, that's not going to matter. It may seem that these are theoretical concepts. They're not. When civilians die, when people are killed, that's not a theoretical position. That's real deaths, and actions result from ideas. And until we change the ideas, the actions will not change. Believe in idealisms for other people, not just for those who look like us. And I hope that people elsewhere listen to this too. That injuries and humiliations of collectives are real. They are real. Nation states have injuries that are very real. And just as hard it is for an individual to recover from humiliation, from the memory of humiliation, it is equally hard for nations to recognize that. And the way to deal with that is not with arrogance. And I just wish that more leaders and more nations would recognize that you have to reconcile with what happened, right? And the moving beyond can only happen. Otherwise, you can just keep picking at the wound, We can keep talking about colonialism. We can keep talking about those histories in an emotional sense without actually wanting to move forward with, okay, now what do we do about it? And I'm putting forward to you the radical proposition that what we do is talk. We talk with lots of people, we bring lots of people together and get them to talk. And we talk about people who are peace builders, not doves. I don't like the word doves in that context. So demand better of leaders. I said this in the aftermath of Pulwama too. We talk about states. States are not just abstract entities you can pull off a shelf. States are made of people who are as real as you and me and people across the border in India. These are people who have ideas, and those ideas may have their own resilience. But believe you me, sometimes it is possible to move beyond those things. Otherwise, slavery would never have ended. We would never have had decolonization. Nothing would have happened. No conflict. Northern Ireland wouldn't have been resolved. No conflict would have been resolved had it not been possible for people to eventually move forward. I think that I will finally close absolutely by saying justice justice and peace should be seen as verbs. They should be seen as things we create. And I think in this environment of this violence, one may hope for, and I do hope for, better results from the elections. I hope that people recognize what is happening and want to, and actively, I want to say there are people who do recognize the violence that has been carried out in their name. And those are the voices that we need to amplify. Don't practice, I would say, to both, certainly to people who believe in Hindutva in India, but I would say more generally to people who believe in ideologies that require corpses. Do not believe in those ideologies. The theorist Laurent Berlant called something cruel optimism. A cruel optimism is when something that you desire is an obstacle to your flourishing. And I think much of this hegemonic, almost insane desire not to talk about things, to move forward, comes from a kind of cruel optimism. It's like, we will not yield. Well, nobody's asking you to yield. Let's start by talking. Let's start by recognizing that there are problems here. And, and of course, the state of affairs, as you know, and by the way, last 10 years at least, you can read details of whatever I've said about many of the things that these speakers have mentioned. They are all, documented. I've said them. I stand by every single word I've said. But I want to also emphasize, yes, this is happening. Let's not lose hope. Every single person, my job is as a gardener. Wherever I go, whoever I speak to, I'm trying to plant a seed in your head. I'm trying to say it's possible. We can dream better. It may not flourish, but if it does, believe me, it'll be worth for every one of us. And not just for me as a Kashmiri individual, not just for my people who are being killed in conflicts, but for everyone. And that's the note of hope I would like to end on.
Thank you very much.